It was one of those nights where the silence itself felt too loud. The kind of silence that presses down on you, squeezing your chest, making every creak and whisper of the world feel like it's hiding something just beyond your line of sight. I had stayed at a friend's place too late. Lost track of time, I guess. The walk home was supposed to be just another uneventful, lonely trudge through the city. I wasn't far from home, but that walk, in the dead of night, would become something I would never forget. The streets were empty, not a single soul in sight. The usual hum of distant traffic was absent, leaving me with only the muffled sound of my footsteps on the pavement. I adjusted my hoodie, pulled it tighter around my neck, trying to ward off the creeping cold that wasn't just in the air but seemed to slither its way into my bones. I kept my head down, watching the pavement. There was something comforting in focusing on that, one foot in front of the other, the rhythm of walking keeping the growing unease at bay. But then I heard it. It was faint at first, a barely noticeable echo behind me, almost drowned out by my own steps. I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe the wind, a stray cat, or a distant car. But as I turned down the next block, the sound grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, keeping pace with me. My pulse quickened and I felt the first surge of panic crawl up my spine. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street was empty, save for dim streetlights casting eerie pools of light that seemed to barely keep the dark at bay. I shook it off. I was tired, overthinking it. I kept walking, a little faster now, trying to shrug off the growing tension. But the footsteps, they picked up too. Not running, just closing in. Steady, like whoever was there wasn't in a rush, like they had all the time in the world. "Don't turn around," I muttered to myself, but my body betrayed me. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned. Nothing. The street was deserted, but there was a heavy feeling in the air, a presence like something was watching me from just outside the edge of the light. My heart was hammering in my chest now, and the silence that followed felt suffocating, like the city itself was holding its breath. I forced myself to keep moving, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, every alleyway, every parked car suddenly feeling like it was hiding something just out of view. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked it, ready to call someone, anyone. But the screen was blank, no signal. That didn't make sense. Not here, not in the middle of the city. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to break into a run. "Calm down, you're just imagining things," I told myself, but my feet were already moving faster. Then I heard it. The voice. It wasn't a shout or a call. It was a whisper. Low, raspy, and impossibly close, right behind me. "Hey, wait." I stopped breathing. For a second I was frozen, every muscle in my body tensed as my mind raced, trying to decide whether to turn around or keep walking. The voice, it didn't sound right. It didn't sound human. There was something wrong with it, like it came from a throat that hadn't spoken in years. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I turned around. He was standing there, maybe 10 feet away. A man, at least, it looked like a man. His clothes were wrong, like something out of another era. Old, frayed at the edges, like he'd been wearing them for far too long. His face. God, his face was pale, too pale, like the blood had drained out of it, and his eyes, wide, dark, and empty, were locked onto mine. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there, staring. And then he smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth or friendliness. It was cold, mechanical, a baring of teeth more than an expression. My stomach dropped. I took a step back and he mirrored it. Not fast, not slow, just perfectly in sync with me, as if he knew exactly what I was going to do before I did it. His smile grew wider and he tilted his head slightly, the way a predator does when it's sizing up its prey. "I just want to talk," he said, his voice a scratchy, dead sound that sent ice down my spine. Why don't you come closer?" My breath hitched. The air felt thick, too thick, and it was getting harder to move. It was like the night itself was pressing in on me, and I could feel him, this thing, getting closer, though he wasn't moving. I took another step back, and suddenly, I couldn't stop. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, my legs screaming as I pushed myself faster than I'd ever run in my life. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care that the streetlights were growing dimmer the further I went. All I knew was I had to get away. My lungs burned, my chest tightened, but I didn't dare slow down. Not with the sound of footsteps chasing me, pounding against the pavement, getting closer and closer. I glanced back, and there he was, closer than ever, still smiling, still calm, like he was playing some kind of sick game. I nearly stumbled, barely catching myself as I sprinted into the nearest alley, my only hope to lose him in the labyrinth of back streets. But the footsteps, they never stopped. They were right there, echoing louder and louder. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning, and every breath felt like fire in my chest. But eventually, I couldn't hear him anymore. I stopped, gasping for air, leaning against a wall in a dark alleyway, trying to convince myself I had lost him. Then I heard it again. That voice, closer than ever. "Found you." I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was stumbling out of the alley and onto the street, blinded by headlights as a car screeched to a halt in front of me. A man jumped out, yelling, asking if I was okay. I couldn't speak. I just pointed back at the alley, but when he looked, there was no one there. To this day, I don't walk home at night, and when the streets are quiet, when the air feels too still, I swear I can still hear those footsteps. I shouldn't have taken that shortcut. I knew it from the moment I stepped off the main road. It was one of those decisions you make when you're too tired to think straight, the kind you regret almost instantly. But at that moment, all I wanted was to get home. It was past midnight and the streets were deserted, the kind of night where even the city seemed asleep. The air was cold, biting through my thin jacket as I made my way down the narrow alleyway that cut behind the old warehouse district. It was supposed to shave 10 minutes off my walk, but instead it felt like I'd stepped into another world. The streetlights barely worked back here, casting long, flickering shadows, and the buildings loomed over me like silent sentinels, their windows dark and lifeless. I kept my head down, hands shoved deep into my pockets, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at me. There was no reason to feel this way, I told myself. It was just an alley, just a quiet night, nothing more. But then I heard it. A noise, faint at first, like a distant scrape of something heavy against concrete. I froze, straining my ears. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. My heart began to race, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone there. Nothing. Just the long, empty stretch of alleyway behind me. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "Get it together," I muttered under my breath and kept walking, a little faster now. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That creeping sensation of being watched, of not being alone. Another sound, closer this time. A low, guttural growl like the sound of metal scraping against stone, but deeper. Wrong. My entire body tensed, and I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The alley was empty, the dim light flickering above me. But there, in the darkness at the far end, something moved. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, but then I saw it. A shape, enormous, crouched low to the ground, too big to be human. My pulse pounded in my ears as I squinted, trying to make out what it was. It was hunched, its long limbs grotesquely bent, and the way it moved. It wasn't right. It was slow, deliberate, like it was stalking me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and for a moment I was frozen, staring at it. The air around me seemed to thicken, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as it crawled forward, inching out of the shadows. That's when I saw it fully. It wasn't human. No way in hell. Its body was covered in patches of matted fur, twisted and uneven, like something that had once been burned and left to heal wrong. Its arms were too long, nearly dragging on the ground as it moved, its fingers ending in long, jagged claws that scraped against the pavement. And its eyes. Those eyes were the worst part. They were huge, glowing a sickly yellow, unblinking, locked onto me with a predatory intensity that made my blood run cold. Its mouth was a mess of sharp, broken teeth, dripping with something thick and dark. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't listen. All I could do was stand there, helpless, as the thing crept closer, its breathing heavy and wet, like it was tasting the air between us. And then it stopped. It tilted its head as if it was studying me, deciding what to do next. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint, rhythmic tapping of its claws against the concrete. The alley suddenly felt too narrow, the walls closing in, trapping me with this thing. My legs finally responded, and I stumbled backward, my heart slamming against my ribs. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as fast as they could carry me. But I could hear it. That thing, whatever it was following. Its heavy, uneven footsteps echoed behind me, faster than they had any right to be. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning with every breath. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, the end nowhere in sight. I could feel it gaining on me, its foul breath hot on the back of my neck, and I knew, if I slowed down for even a second, it would be on me. I glanced back just for a second. A mistake. It was right there, closer than I thought, its massive form loping after me with an unnatural speed. The way it moved was all wrong, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but the sheer terror driving me forward kept me going. I burst out of the alley, back onto the main road, gasping for air. The street was still deserted. No cars, no people, no one. I kept running, my legs shaking, every instinct in me screaming to get as far away as possible. But the sound behind me, it was gone. I stopped, wheezing, hands on my knees as I struggled to catch my breath. I spun around, expecting to see it barreling after me, but the alley was empty. There was nothing there. Just the same stretch of cracked pavement and dim streetlights. I stood there, panting, waiting for it to come charging out of the shadows. But it didn't. Slowly, I backed away, my eyes darting from corner to corner, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the darkness had played tricks on me. But no, I felt it. I saw it, that thing was real. I didn't stop walking until I got home, locking every door, every window, and collapsing onto my bed, drenched in cold sweat. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares of glowing eyes and claws scraping against the pavement. The next morning I went back to the alley. Stupid, I know. I had to see if it was still there. But the alley was just as I'd left it. Empty, quiet, except for the deep gouges in the concrete, long and jagged, like something with claws had dragged itself across the ground. I don't walk that way anymore. I don't walk alone at night at all, because sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear it. That slow, heavy breathing, the scrape of claws on concrete, and I know it's still out there, waiting. I wasn't supposed to be out that late, and neither was Jake. But we'd both had a few beers, lost track of time, and suddenly the bars were closing, spilling us into the deserted streets of our small town. It was one of those nights where the air felt thick with humidity, clinging to our skin as we made the long walk home. I remember glancing at my phone, 3:12 a.m. We'd missed the last bus and the cabs weren't running, so we figured we'd hoof it, cut through the back streets to shave off some time. Jake was in good spirits, laughing about something stupid, but I felt uneasy. There was something off about the night. It wasn't just the empty streets or the way the street lights flickered. It was this strange stillness in the air, as if the world was holding its breath. I didn't want to say anything, didn't want to look paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We turned onto Maple Street, a narrow road lined with old, rundown houses, the kind of place that always seemed to have one too many shadows. It was a shortcut we'd taken before, but tonight it felt different. The houses loomed over us, their windows dark and hollow, like eyes watching from the past. Jake stopped mid-sentence, glancing around. "Man, this place gives me the creeps tonight," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I forced a laugh. "Yeah, it's always got that abandoned town vibe." But the truth was, I agreed with him. I kept my head down, walking faster, hoping to just get through it. But then, just ahead of us, something caught my eye. At first, it was just a flash of white in the darkness, like someone standing in the shadows. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, she was still there. A woman. She was standing under one of the street lights, her figure barely illuminated by the weak yellow glow. She wasn't moving, just standing there, unnervingly still. Her dress was the first thing that struck me. It was old-fashioned, like something out of a black and white photo, a long, flowing vintage dress that looked impossibly out of place in the modern world. Her hair was dark, tangled, hanging limply around her face. Jake saw her too. "Who the hell?" he whispered, his voice tight. We slowed down, neither of us daring to say a word. There was something wrong with her, something deeply unsettling. Her head was slightly tilted, her face obscured by the shadows. My mouth went dry and I felt my stomach twist into knots. The air around us grew colder, a chill that seeped into my bones despite the warm night. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as if waiting for something. "What do we do?" Jake asked under his breath, his voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to get the hell out of there. But we were already halfway down the street, and something about the way she was standing, the stillness, the silence, kept me rooted in place. It was like she was daring us to come closer, and then she moved. It wasn't a natural movement. She didn't step forward like a person would. It was as if she glided, her feet never quite touching the ground, her dress rippling around her like she was underwater. My breath caught in my throat as she drew closer, her head lifting ever so slightly, enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. I wish I hadn't looked. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over her bones. Her eyes, God, her eyes were black, hollow, empty. They stared straight through me like she wasn't really seeing me, but something behind me, something far, far away. And that smile, twisted, unnatural, like her lips had been pulled back too far. It wasn't a smile of joy or warmth. It was a smile of something cold, cruel, something that didn't belong in this world. Jake grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "We need to go," he whispered, panic rising in his voice. I nodded, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground, my body paralyzed by the sheer terror coursing through me. The air around us seemed to thicken, growing colder and heavier with every second. And then, without warning, she spoke. "Come, closer." Her voice was a raspy whisper, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. It wasn't a request. It was a command, something dark and ancient that chilled me to my core. My legs trembled, and I took a step back, but the sound of her voice seemed to wrap around me, pulling me in, urging me to step forward, to obey. No, no way, Jake muttered, pulling me harder, trying to get us both to move. We're getting out of here. But as we turned to run, she was suddenly in front of us. I didn't see her move. One moment she was under the streetlight, the next she was blocking our path, her dark eyes locked onto mine. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat thudding in my ears as I stared into those void-like eyes, feeling the cold radiating from her. "You can't leave," she whispered, that sick smile still twisting her face. "Stay. With me." I stumbled back, dragging Jake with me, my legs finally responding to the sheer panic that was consuming me. We turned and ran, sprinting back the way we'd come, not daring to look back. My chest burned, my heart raced, but the only thing I could think about was getting away from her. The street stretched on endlessly in front of us, and I could still feel her presence behind me, like her cold gaze was burning into the back of my neck. Jake's footsteps echoed in time with mine, our ragged breaths the only sound cutting through the suffocating silence. But then, there was a sound behind us, a soft, wet, dragging sound, like fabric trailing against the ground. I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder. She was still there, gliding after us, her dress brushing the pavement like the whisper of death itself. Her mouth opened wider, that terrible smile splitting her face even further as her eyes bored into mine. I could feel something pulling at me, tugging at the very edges of my mind, urging me to stop, to turn around, to let her in. "Don't look back," Jake screamed, his voice breaking through the fog of terror in my head. I whipped my head forward, pushing myself harder, my legs burning as we finally burst onto the main road. The lights of passing cars and distant houses seemed too bright, too real after the suffocating darkness of Maple Street. We didn't stop running until we were halfway to my house, gasping for breath, our hands on our knees, drenched in sweat. When I finally dared to look back, the street was empty. No sign of her, but the air still felt wrong, heavy, oppressive, as if her presence lingered just beyond the shadows, waiting. Jake didn't say anything. Neither did I. We didn't need to. We both knew we'd seen something that night, something not of this world. I haven't taken that shortcut since. Neither has Jake, and every now and then, when I pass by the end of Maple Street, I swear I see a figure standing there, just out of the corner of my eye. A woman, waiting in the shadows, her black eyes watching, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of walking down that street, alone.